Good morning, friends, and welcome back to our 5-part series on the Bible as a 5-act play. This week we're focusing on Act 2, the fall. Oh, the fall. How much guilt have we been taught to carry around as a result of this event? Let's take a look at it for a few moments and then talk about why it matters in the context of Scripture and in our own life today. So last week we talked about creation. 2 narratives. The first that frames it in terms of 7 days, followed by Sabbath rest, or that culminate in Sabbath rest, I should say. 6 days of creating and 1 day of resting. And it focuses on this world being created with intentionality and love, affirming the goodness of all that exists. And then the second narrative tells more of a human story about God creating people from the dust of the earth and giving them charge over the garden. From this story, we get our sense of responsibility toward creation, though you could make a case for that from the first one as well, and our humility in recognizing that we are but dust, and to dust we shall return. So everything's going great. But now the play comes to its first major plot point, the fall. Humans have been given everything. Everything! A beautiful garden, abundant food, warmth, total lack of body shame. And best of all, closeness and friendship with God. We see God in this story walking in the garden. And yes, that's totally oversimplifying things and making God seem more like a person than we would ever believe God could be. But doesn't that show us a picture of a God with whom we can have a kind of closeness for which humans have always longed? Does it not maybe foreshadow things to come with the incarnation of Jesus later? We'll get back to that. All Adam and Eve had to do was avoid the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that's exactly what tempts Eve, isn't it? I mean, we can blame the serpent, or we can blame the lusciousness of the fruit, but seriously, all that fruit in the garden, what made this fruit look so appealing was the realization that eating it would make her, in a sense, her own God. And the consequences of this act are huge, aren't they? First, she relishes her newfound power, but like all of us, she immediately wants to draw someone else into it, and Adam happily obliges. And then the two of them start to realize that they got more than they bargained for. And now, along with their knowledge, comes a sense of shame. Shame at their nakedness, and shame at their wrongdoing. Then they try to pass the blame for their choices. Adam onto Eve, Eve onto the serpent. Do we even need to talk about how all this is still relevant today? So, as a result of their wrongdoing, their will to be their own boss, rather than let God guide their lives and choices, they have to leave the garden. They can't live in perfection anymore because their own selfishness would corrupt the goodness of Eden. Instead, they're out on their own, where they'll have to sweat to grow their crops and experience difficulty in childbearing. Life's no picnic. So why does this matter in Scripture? Well, it pretty much sets up the whole rest of the play. Creation started out with something beautiful, and now humans have nearly ruined it. But God's goodness and love are stronger than even our sin and shortcomings. God has a plan to make it all right again, to bring us back together in spite of our stubbornness and self-interest. And we'll see in the rest of the Bible that plan working over thousands of years to bring redemption of what went wrong. In the short term, the fall leads to all kinds of chaos and violence. Cain kills Abel. People are so wicked, God sends a flood on the land except for Noah and his family. And don't get too caught up on what this says about God. This is a reframing of other ancient myths that make their gods look way worse. This is supposed to be a story about showing God's goodness and faithfulness by comparison. It just doesn't play well in the modern era. Anyway, so we have murder. We have wickedness. We have divisions in families as Jacob and Esau fight for blessing and inheritance and success. And just as with Cain and Abel, we have jealous brothers attempting to kill a sibling as Joseph gets left in a well and then sold off to slave traders and sent down to Egypt. And that story ends up having a happy ending and setting things up for Exodus. But we see this fallout of the fall right away throughout the rest of the book of Genesis. So, the fall, then, is important in Scripture because it leads to continuous human sin and suffering, and because it's the conflict and challenge at the heart of the whole play. the thing that needs resolution in order for us to reach that endpoint of redemption and a return to the fullness of joy that God intended in creation. Historically, Christians have seen Jesus as a kind of new Adam who resists temptation and offers new life to creation. So what about today? Why does this matter? I mean, depending on your feelings about the concept of original sin, that we're all born predisposed to sin because we inherit it somehow from the first one, it may seem more or less relevant to you, depending on how you look at that. But I'm going to sidestep that whole conversation for right now and focus instead on the consequences that were explicitly named in Genesis, because I think they still ring true. Adam is told, "By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground." So in other words, if we want to eat, we'll have to work, and it's going to be hard. Our economy today may function differently than theirs did, so we outsource our agriculture to some while others work in offices or trades, but we all have to work. And it's difficult, downright exhausting at times, especially in a pandemic when we don't know how to juggle everything that we have to and we don't have any childcare. But we all have to do it. And the other thing is the mention that we will return to the ground. So here we see the reference to our being made from dirt, ashes to ashes. The fall also leads to death. And as women, let's not forget the consequences proclaimed to Eve. With pain, you will give birth to children. We had a presentation in December by Stephanie Matthews, a professor at Point Loma Nazarene, in which she talked about women's reproductive pain throughout Scripture and its implications for justice today. And I'm going to link that below because it was fascinating everybody just raved about it. But her starting point was that this passage means more than just that the process of birthing a child will hurt. Nowadays, thank goodness, we have epidurals for people who want them. But we still experience all kinds of pain and sorrow in the process of bringing children into the world, don't we? Miscarriage, infertility, gynecological discomfort, recovery from labor or a C-section, breastfeeding struggles. The list goes on and on. Continuing the human race through producing food and through producing humans is hard work. And in the end, we die. That message doesn't feel very hopeful, but that's exactly why we need to read the whole of Scripture, the whole play, because this is just the setup for the wonderful freedom and forgiveness and hope that we receive in Jesus. But first, Act 3, the story of Israel, next week. So come back.